The adult human skeletal system consists of 206 bones as well as a network of tendons and ligaments and cartilage that connects them. The skeletal system performs vital functions like support and movement and protection, blood cell production, calcium storage, and endocrine regulation. All these things enable us to survive. Today's presentation covers the skeletal system. Let's talk about the functions of bones in a little bit more detail. The first function is support. They provide a framework for your muscles and skin and organs of the body. They also serve a protective function. The skull protects the brain, and the vertebrae protect the spinal cord, and so on. For movement, bones act as levers to move the body. They also are important in mineral storage and act as a reservoir to store calcium and phosphorus. And they're important in blood cell formation. Most blood cell formation occurs within the marrow of bones. Bones are classified into 4 different categories. They are long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones, and we'll look at each of these. Long bones are bones that are longer than wide, and this includes most bones of the limbs. Short bones are designated as those bones that are as wide as they are long. Their primary function is to provide support and stability with little to no movement. They include the bones of the wrist, the carpals, and the ankle bones. Flat bones are bones whose principal function is either extensive protection or the provision of a broad surface for muscular attachment. They're usually very thin, they are flattened, and they have a bit of a curve to them. Examples are the sternum and most of the skull bones. Irregular bones fit in none of the other categories, and they serve various purposes in the body, such as protection of the nervous tissue, and this would be the vertebrae, and the protection is of the spinal cord. Another example besides vertebrae are the hip bones.
Here are some important terms to know when you're talking about bones. Epiphyses are the swollen ends of the bone. The diaphysis is the shaft of the bone in between those 2 swollen ends. The epiphyseal plate is a narrow area of bone where growth occurs during childhood. The medullary cavity is the center of the bone. In adults, the medullary cavity is filled with yellow marrow, but yellow can convert to red marrow, which makes new blood cells if a person becomes very anemic.
2 terms that you should be familiar with in the skeletal system are osteoblasts, and those are bone-forming cells, and osteoclasts, which are bone-destroying cells. You need both of them in balance to work well. There's a video that covers osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Please watch this video. Hematopoiesis is the process in the body by which all blood cells are formed. This process occurs only in red marrow. In adults, the long bones are filled with yellow marrow, so hematopoiesis does not occur here. Yellow marrow can convert to red marrow if a person becomes anemic. If you look at the picture on the right, this shows a condition known as koilonychia, and this means spoon-shaped nails, and it's found in people who have iron-deficient anemia. This picture shows you a section through a bone. In this bone, you can see both red marrow and yellow marrow. This slide shows you a microscopic section through bone. You're looking at a type of bone known as spongy bone and located primarily on the ends of bones. Spongy bone is important because it acts as a shock absorber. Every day the human body goes through high volumes of impacts like walking and skiing and running, and it's important to have shock absorbers.
This slide shows you a microscopic section through compact bone. Note on the right where compact bone is located.
Osteogenesis is the formation and development of bony tissue. At 6 weeks, the skeleton is composed of fibrous membrane and cartilage, and this needs to be converted to bony tissue. This bone formation begins at about 6 weeks of age. It's important before this to have a more pliable skeleton or a fibrous and cartilage skeleton because this aids sometimes in the birth process when it's difficult to get the fetus through the birth canal. Below is a picture of a fetal skull. You should notice that the skull is not entirely bony in nature. There are 2 areas known as the fontanelles, the anterior and posterior fontanelles or soft spots where there is no bone tissue. By about 9 to 18 months, these areas will fill in and become bony in nature. The reason for these soft spots is because sometimes during delivery in the birth canal, it's important that the head be able to be made just a little bit smaller, and by having the fontanelles, this is possible. There is a hormone known as growth hormone that affects the growth of long bones of the body. Too little of this hormone results in a condition known as dwarfism. Too much of this hormone results in a condition known as gigantism. Dwarfism is short stature that results from a genetic or a medical condition. It's generally defined as an adult height of 4 feet 10 inches or less. Depending on the cause of dwarfism, there are treatments possible. Sometimes it is treatment to elongate the bones, and that's a surgical treatment, and sometimes it's administration of a hormone, in particular growth hormone, early in the child's life before their growth plates have closed. Gigantism is a rare condition that causes abnormal growth in children. The change is most notable usually in terms of height, but sometimes their girth can also be affected. It occurs when a child's pituitary gland makes too much growth hormone. This in the last slide represents one of the more famous cases of gigantism. This is Andre the Giant. Andre was born to parents of normal stature in France. What they discovered early in childhood was that Andre was making too much growth hormone. The problem with this is it's hard on a person's heart and on all the other internal organs. Often they will not live beyond the age of 40. The most common bone disorder is bone breakage. Here is a list of the more common types of fractures, and we will be going through this list one by one. The first type of a fracture is known as a simple fracture, also sometimes called a closed fracture, and the reason is the bone breaks very cleanly, but it does not go through the skin. The second type of fracture is a compound fracture, and it's more serious than the simple fracture is. The reason for that is the simple fracture does not penetrate the skin, and the compound fracture does. You can see the ends of the bone coming through the skin and being exposed to bacteria and dirt in the environment. This can lead to a bone infection known as osteomyelitis, and that can be very dangerous. Antibiotics will be required to treat this kind of a fracture. The next slide is that of a compound fracture, and it's very graphic. If you're concerned, you may not want to view the following slide.
Remember the definition of a compound fracture. It's more serious than a simple fracture, primarily because the broken ends of the bone penetrate the skin, and you can see this quite clearly in this picture. It's easy to understand why bone infections can occur. Remember, bone infections are known as osteomyelitis, and why antibiotics are required.
This is a comminuted fracture, where the bone actually breaks or fragments into many, many pieces. It's common among the aged where the bones are brittle. A compression fracture is a break in which the bone is actually crushed. It's common in people with very porous bones, like the elderly who have osteoporosis. In a depression fracture, the bone is actually pressed inward. It's very typical of a skull fracture, and you can see what that looks like in the picture below. An impacted fracture is a break in which the broken ends of the bone are actually forced into one another. It's a very common type of fracture that you see in someone who's trying to break their fall with their arm. A spiral fracture is a very common type of sports fracture. One example would be when someone was running and came down on their foot, and once they landed on their foot, their leg twisted because they had so much momentum. A green stick fracture occurs when a bone bends and cracks instead of breaking completely into separate pieces. The fracture looks similar to what happens when you try and break a small green branch on a tree. Most green stick fractures occur in children younger than 10 years of age. This type of broken bone most commonly occurs in children because their bones are soft and more flexible than the bones of adults. Even mild green stick fractures are usually immobilized in a cast. In addition to holding the cracked pieces of the bone together so they can heal, a cast will help prevent the bone from breaking all the way through if the child falls in it again. This video shows what a spiral fracture looks like. It's a very graphic video, and it occurred during a kickboxing event. You may choose not to view this.